Two men humiliates old woman on train, unaware who is behind them. The 5:47 p.m. express train to Burlington was running late, again. Sarah Chin, the station supervisor, had just announced another 15-minute delay due to signal problems, causing a collective groan from the crowd of waiting passengers. Among them stood Margaret Wilson, her 72-year-old frame slightly hunched, clutching a paper bag that had seen better days. But unlike the other passengers who checked their phones or paced impatiently, Margaret seemed lost in thought, her weathered hands absently tracing the outline of something inside her bag. When the train finally arrived, the usual rush hour chaos ensued. Margaret waited patiently, letting others push past her. A young woman with a baby stroller caught her eye, struggling to manage her bags. Without hesitation, Margaret picked up one of the fallen bags and handed it to the grateful mother. It was a small gesture, one that went unnoticed by most, except for a man standing a few feet away, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. The interior of the train car felt unusually stuffy that evening. Margaret found a seat near the window, carefully placing her bag on her lap. The paper crinkled slightly, and she adjusted it with particular care, as if its contents were precious. Her fingers, marked with decades of hard work, trembled slightly, not from age, but from anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay." The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "We should arrive at Burlington Station in approximately 50 minutes. The doors were about to close when two men burst through them, laughing loudly at some private joke. They were the kind of men who demanded attention, expensive suits, designer watches, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes from believing the world exists for their entertainment. The taller one, who would later introduce himself as Blake Thompson, VP of Strategic Development at some corporation or other, was speaking loudly into his AirPods about a recent golf game. His companion, shorter but equally well-dressed, scanned the crowded car for seats. His eyes landed on Margaret, and a smirk played across his face. He nudged Blake, who ended his call with a laugh. Well, the shorter man said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Looks like we found a seat in the vintage section." He gestured toward the empty spaces near Margaret. Blake chuckled, adjusting his Italian silk tie. "Careful, James. You might catch something. When was the last time those clothes saw a washing machine?" Their words carried across the car, causing several passengers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A teenager wearing headphones removed them, frowning at the men's behavior. But no one said anything. This was the city, after all, where minding your own business was an art form. Margaret's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around her bag. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching the urban landscape scroll past, but her reflection showed a flash of something in her eyes, not fear or embarrassment, but something deeper, more complex. What the two men didn't notice, in their self-absorbed amusement, was the subtle change in atmosphere 3 rows behind them. A man in his late 30s, dressed in casual clothes that nonetheless seemed to fit him with military precision, had stopped reading his book. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes had taken on the focused intensity of a predator assessing its prey. "Hey, Grandma," James called out, encouraged by the lack of resistance. "What's in the bag? Your life savings and pennies?" He high-fived Blake, both men guffawing at their perceived wit. Margaret finally turned to look at them, and for a brief moment, something unexpected crossed her face, not hurt, but almost amusement, as if she were party to a joke they couldn't understand. She opened her mouth to speak, but Blake cut her off. "Oh, look, she's going to tell us a story about the Great Depression," he mock-whispered to James. "Or maybe share some hard candies from her purse." The man 3 rows back slowly closed his book, placing it precisely on the empty seat beside him. His movements were economical, practiced, like a chess player positioning pieces for an endgame. But still, he waited, watching. What happened next surprised everyone in the car. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small, velvet jewelry box. With deliberate movements, she opened it, revealing what appeared to be an antique pocket watch. The gold surface caught the light, throwing brilliant reflections across the car. "Actually," she said, her voice clear and steady, I was going to sell this at Burlington's antique auction house. It's a rare 1854 Patek Philippe, one of only 7 ever made. She held it up, letting the light dance across its surface. I was going to use the money to help fund a new children's wing at St. Mary's Hospital. But since you seem so interested in my financial situation. The two men's laughter died in their throats. James's face had gone slightly pale. He worked in luxury goods and knew exactly what she was holding. Such a watch could easily be worth millions. But before anyone could react further, the train lurched violently. The screech of emergency brakes filled the air, and passengers were thrown forward in their seats. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed Margaret's bag falling to the floor, its contents spilling out, revealing not just the watch, but something else, something that would change the entire story in ways no one could have predicted. The man 3 rows back was already on his feet, moving with purpose. But he wasn't just heading toward Margaret. His eyes were fixed on something else entirely, something that made his training kick in instantly. Because this wasn't just a story about 2 bullies getting their comeuppance. This was about to become something much more dangerous, and Margaret Wilson was at the center of it all. The contents of Margaret's bag scattered across the train car floor like pieces of a puzzle nobody knew they were solving. Among them, a manila envelope split open, spilling photographs that slid under seats and into the aisle. But it wasn't the vintage watch that caught the military man's attention. It was the small red light blinking steadily from within the lining of Margaret's fallen bag. As passengers steadied themselves from the sudden stop, Blake and James stumbled forward, their expensive shoes sliding on the scattered photographs. James grabbed one to keep from falling, and his face went from annoyed to confused to shocked in the span of seconds. "Wait a minute," he whispered to Blake, holding up the photo. "Isn't this?" Blake's arrogant demeanor vanished as he recognized what he was seeing. The photo showed him and James, but not at any golf course or board meeting. It showed them walking out of an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, carrying briefcases. The timestamp read 3:27 a.m., 3 nights ago. The military-trained observer, whose name was Michael Chen, though he hadn't used that name in his last 3 assignments, was already moving. He'd recognized the device in Margaret's bag for what it was, a sophisticated tracking beacon, the kind used in high-level surveillance operations. His mind raced through possibilities. FBI? CIA? Private contractor? But something wasn't adding up. "Nobody move!" Margaret's voice cut through the confusion, but it wasn't the same trembling tone they'd heard earlier. She stood straight now, all traces of frailty gone, pulling something from her jacket, not a weapon, but a badge. "Federal Marshal Margaret Wilson. You too," she pointed at Blake and James, "are under arrest." The transformation was remarkable. The hunched shoulders squared, the trembling hands steadied, and even her face seemed to shed years of aging. Some of it had been masterful makeup, Michael realized. He'd seen similar disguise work in his own line of operations. But before Margaret could step toward the stunned executives, Michael's training screamed a warning. The blinking device in her bag wasn't Marshal Service issue. It was military grade, and it wasn't sending a signal out. It was counting down. "Everybody down!" Michael's voice carried the unmistakable authority of command. "Marshal, that bag's been compromised." Margaret's eyes widened in recognition of both his tone and his warning. Without hesitation, she shifted her aim from the executives to her own bag, finally seeing the device that had been planted on her equipment. The other passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold like some bizarre theater performance, finally began to react. Some screamed, others ducked under seats. The young mother Margaret had helped earlier clutched her baby tighter, frozen in fear. Blake and James tried to use the chaos to their advantage, making a break for the door between cars. But they'd forgotten about the photographs scattered across the floor. James slipped, catching himself on a handrail, while Blake crashed directly into an elderly man who turned out to be far stronger than he looked. Another agent, Michael realized. This wasn't just a 2-person operation. "Michael Chen," Margaret called out, her eyes never leaving the bag. "Section 7, right?" I was wondering when they'd send one of you. You know I go by Anderson now, Michael replied, carefully approaching the bag. And I'm not here for your operation. But that device in your bag? That's from my side of the fence. Someone's playing both of us. The red lights blinking increased in speed. In the distance, sirens wailed. The train's emergency stop hadn't been an accident. Someone had triggered it remotely. But why? To trap them all in place? Or to ensure they stopped at exactly this location? Through the windows, Michael caught glimpses of movement on the buildings nearby. Sniper positions, he realized. At least 3 of them. But were they there to protect the operation or threaten it? Blake, still struggling with the disguised elderly agent, started laughing, a high, desperate sound. You don't even know what you're involved in, do you? He called out to Margaret. You think this is about money laundering? About our little side business? This goes so much deeper than your pay grade, Marshal. Margaret's face hardened. Is that why you finished Agent Roberts? Because he figured out how deep it goes? The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Roberts had been his mentor at the academy, years ago. Now, pieces were starting to fall into place, pieces of a puzzle much bigger and deadlier than anyone in this train car had realized. The device's blinking had reached a frantic pace. We've got about 30 seconds, Michael announced, his mind racing through options. Marshal, your team has the perimeter covered? East and north, she replied. We weren't expecting company from above. Yeah, Michael's lips twisted in a grim smile. That would be my department's signature move. Usually. He looked at her significantly. But I don't think those are our people up there. The young mother with the baby suddenly stood up, her face calm and focused. West and south are covered, she said crisply, all traces of fear gone. But we've lost contact with both teams in the last 2 minutes. Michael's respect for the operation increased. They'd layered their covers expertly. But right now, they were all in a death trap, and the clock was ticking down on something much more dangerous than a simple arrest operation. The red light turned solid. Time's up, Michael said quietly. Marshal Wilson, I hope you trust me. Margaret met his eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. Roberts did, she said simply. What happened next would change everything, not just for everyone on the train, but for the entire department. Because Michael Chun was about to make a decision that would either save their lives or expose a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of multiple government agencies. And somewhere above them, a finger tightened on a trigger. Michael's decision came in a flash of clarity. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Margaret's bag and sprinted toward the train's bathroom. The red light had turned solid, but his years of experience told him this wasn't a conventional explosive, it was something worse. The bathroom would have to do as a containment unit. Everyone down! He shouted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded instant obedience. Marshal, get them to the next car! But before anyone could move, the windows exploded inward. The snipers had made their move, but they weren't shooting, they were creating chaos. Smoke grenades bounced across the floor, filling the car with thick gray clouds. Through the haze, Michael caught a glimpse of Blake smiling. Not the nervous smile of a cornered criminal, but the confident grin of someone whose plan was unfolding perfectly. As Michael reached the bathroom, memories flooded his mind, memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Another operation, another train, another device. Agent Roberts had been there that day, 5 years ago. Sometimes the obvious threat isn't the real threat, kid, Roberts had told him. Watch the pieces that don't fit. The pieces that didn't fit. Michael's eyes widened as realization struck. He threw open the bathroom door and hurled the bag inside, but he didn't close the door. Instead, he spun around and shouted, Marshal! The photos! They wanted us to find the photos! Margaret was already moving, her age disguise now completely shed as she moved with the grace of a seasoned operative. She understood immediately. The scattered photographs, they were too perfect, too conveniently spilled. While everyone was focused on the device and the snipers, something else was happening. Through the smoke, The young mother with the baby suddenly called out. "Contact lost with all backup teams. They're not just jamming us, they're using our own frequencies." The elderly man who had stopped Blake had produced a tablet from his jacket. "Satellite coverage is dark. Someone just blinded every eye in the sky over a 10-mile radius." James, who had been quietly edging toward the door, suddenly straightened up and spoke into what appeared to be a cufflink. "Package is secure. Begin Phase 2. That's when Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. The baby in the young agent's arms. It hadn't made a sound during the entire chaos. Not a cry, not a whimper. Because it wasn't a baby at all. "Get away from her!" Michael's warning came just as the young agent realized the same thing. The blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms was emitting the same red light they'd seen in Margaret's bag. "Karen, drop it!" Margaret commanded, but the young agent's arms seemed locked in place, her face contorted in confusion. I can't move," Karen gasped. "Some kind of paralytic." The smoke was getting thicker, but now it had a strange, sweet smell. Michael's trained senses picked up the subtle chemical signature. "They're pumping in TX-88, he called out. "It's a neural agent. Everyone who can move, get to the next car." But Blake's earlier words echoed in Michael's mind. "This goes so much deeper than your pay grade." The pieces suddenly aligned in his mind: the dead satellite coverage, the compromised frequencies, the sophisticated technical equipment. This wasn't just about money laundering or corporate crime. Through the thickening smoke, Michael saw Margaret reach Karen, trying to help her with the device. The elderly agent was covering the rear, but James had vanished. Blake remained, still wearing that knowing smile. "Roberts figured it out, didn't he?" Michael called out to Blake, buying time as he quickly typed a code into his phone. "That's why he had to die. He found the connection between Section 7 and your corporation." Blake's smile widened. "Roberts was a good man. Right up until he believed he could fight an entire system. Some machines are too big to stop, Mr. Chin. Or should I call you Agent Anderson? Or perhaps Lieutenant Matthews? How many names have you worn for Section 7? Michael's phone vibrated, confirmation that his emergency signal had pierced through the jamming. Help was coming, but they had to survive the next few minutes. Margaret had reached Karen and was attempting to disengage the device, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite the neural agent beginning to affect her movements. The elderly agent had slumped against the wall, overcome by the gas. "You know what's funny?" Blake continued, seemingly immune to the effects of the gas. "He must have taken the counteragent before boarding. Roberts said almost the exact same thing you did about the photos. Right before he jumped. Or, well, right before he was encouraged to jump." Michael's muscles were beginning to twitch from the gas, but he forced himself to focus. Robert's last words to him had been about pieces that didn't fit. And right now, something about this entire scenario didn't fit. The device in Karen's arms started beeping, a different pattern from the one in the bag. Through the haze, Michael saw Margaret's eyes widen in recognition. She knew that pattern. And judging by the look of genuine fear that finally cracked Blake's smug expression, this wasn't part of their plan. "Asset compromised?" A new voice crackled through hidden speakers. "Initiating Protocol 0. Blake's smile vanished completely. "No, wait! We haven't secured the..." The lights in the train car suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness. The last thing Michael saw before the darkness took over was Margaret reaching for something in Karen's fake baby bundle. Something that glowed with a familiar blue light he'd seen only once before, in a classified file marked Project Eclipse. The real game was only just beginning, and the true identity of their opponents was about to be revealed. Because in the world of shadows and secrets, sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one hiding in plain sight, wearing a friendly face and a trusted badge. The darkness lasted exactly 3.7 seconds. Michael counted them instinctively, a habit drilled into him during his Section 7 training. When the emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow, the scene had transformed dramatically. Karen had collapsed, the device-laden bundle rolling from her arms. Margaret crouched beside her, one hand checking Karen's pulse while the other held the mysterious, blue-glowing object. Blake was gone, but something else had appeared, a holographic display hovering in the center of the train car, projecting strings of code that Michael recognized with a jolt of shock. "That's impossible," he breathed. "That code was destroyed with Project Eclipse. I watched the servers burn myself." "Did you?" Margaret's voice was steady, despite the neural agent's effects. "Or did you watch what they wanted you to see?" She held up the blue glowing object, and Michael finally saw it clearly, a quantum encryption key, its surface etched with the same symbols now floating in the air around them. The elderly agent, who had seemed unconscious, suddenly sat up straight. When he spoke, his voice had changed completely, losing its frail quaver. "Agent Chen, or whatever your real name is, Project Eclipse wasn't destroyed. It evolved." Through the windows, Michael could see the snipers had vanished. The smoke was beginning to clear, thanks to the train's emergency ventilation system, but the sweet scent of TX-88 lingered. His muscles still twitched from its effects, but years of exposure during training had given him some resistance. "Roberts knew," Margaret continued, her fingers dancing across the quantum key's surface. "He discovered that Eclipse wasn't just about predictive intelligence or surveillance. It was about control. The ability to manipulate not just data, but reality itself." The holographic code shifted, forming images, surveillance footage, financial records, military operations. But something was wrong with them. The timestamps didn't match the events. Cause and effect seemed to flow backward. "Time manipulation," the elderly agent stated flatly. "That's what spooked Roberts. He realized they weren't just predicting the future, they were rewriting the past." The truth hit Michael like a physical blow. The multiple identities he remembered holding, the overlapping missions, the memories that sometimes seemed to contradict each other. "We're not just agents," he said slowly. "We're temporal anchors. Points of stability in an increasingly unstable timeline." Karen stirred, groaning. The paralytic was wearing off, but her eyes were unfocused. "The baby," she mumbled. "The device, it wasn't a weapon. It was a temporal marker. They're tracking changes in the timeline." The holographic display suddenly flickered, and a new image appeared, Agent Roberts, but not as Michael remembered him. This Roberts was older, grayer, and very much alive. The timestamp showed a date 3 weeks in the future. "Hello, Michael," the recording said. "If you're seeing this, then Operation Reset has begun. Everything you think you know about your past, about Section 7, about Project Eclipse, it's all part of a much larger game. Blake and his people? They're just pawns. The real players haven't even shown themselves yet." Margaret's hand tightened on the quantum key. "Roberts left this for us. He knew they would try to erase him, so he created temporal backups. Insurance policies scattered through time." The elderly agent, whose real name, Michael suddenly remembered, was Dr. Alan Chen, the original architect of Project Eclipse and, in at least one timeline, Michael's father, pulled out a small device that looked like a compass. But instead of pointing north, its needle spun wildly. "The temporal distortions are getting worse," Dr. Chen announced. "Every time they change something, the fabric of reality becomes more unstable. That's why they need us, temporal anchors, to prevent complete collapse." Through the train's windows, Michael noticed something bizarre. The city skyline seemed to be shifting, buildings appearing and disappearing like waves on a digital ocean. Most of the passengers wouldn't notice. Their minds would automatically adjust, creating false memories to maintain temporal consistency. But for temporal anchors like them, the changes were clearly visible. "Roberts didn't finish himself," Michael said, pieces finally clicking into place. "In the original timeline, he succeeded. He exposed everything. So they went back and stopped him. But he anticipated that move and created us," Margaret finished. "A team of temporal anchors, positioned throughout key points in the timeline, each carrying a piece of the truth. The question is, why activate us now?" The holographic display changed again, showing a countdown, 47 hours 13 minutes and 22 seconds and decreasing. Because something big is coming, Dr. Chen said grimly. Something that even the timeline manipulators are afraid of. Look at the pattern of their changes. They're not trying to control the future anymore. They're trying to prevent it. Karen had managed to sit up, her training helping her fight off the last effects of the paralytic. The neural agent, she said. It wasn't meant to incapacitate us. It was meant to wake us up. To make us remember who we really are. Suddenly, the train car shuddered. Outside, the shifting skyline had stopped moving, frozen in an impossible configuration of past, present, and potential futures. The countdown accelerated, numbers blurring. They're making their move, Dr. Chen announced, checking his temporal compass. All timelines are converging on a single point. Michael looked at the quantum key in Margaret's hand, then at the frozen city outside, and finally at the team of temporal anchors gathered in this train car. Robert said Operation Reset has begun. I think I finally understand what that means. Because in that moment, as reality itself seemed to hold its breath, Michael Chen remembered everything, not just one past, but many. And he realized that their true mission wasn't to stop the timeline manipulators. It was to ensure they succeeded. The quantum key in Margaret's hand pulsed with increasing intensity, its blue light casting strange shadows across the train car. Outside, the frozen cityscape had taken on an oily sheen, as if reality itself was becoming fluid. The countdown now read 32 hours 41 minutes and 7 seconds, but the numbers seemed to skip erratically, sometimes running backward for brief moments. In the original timeline, Dr. Chen explained, his fingers dancing across his temporal compass. Humanity discovered something in the year 2047. Something that changed everything. The timeline manipulators have been trying to prevent that discovery, but each change they make only brings it closer. Karen had fully recovered now, her training as a temporal anchor asserting itself. The Prometheus Protocol, she said, the words coming from memories that hadn't existed moments ago. That's what they found. Or will find. Or would have found. She shook her head, frustrated by the limitations of linear language. Michael's mind raced through multiple sets of memories, each from a different timeline. In one, he was a decorated military officer. In another, a rogue operative. In yet another, he had died stopping a terrorist attack in Dubai. But through all these variations, one constant remained: Agent Roberts. Roberts wasn't just leaving us insurance policies, Michael said slowly, watching the holographic display shift through temporal data. He was creating a temporal mesh network. Each of us carries fragments of information that only make sense when the timelines converge. Margaret nodded, her fingers still working the quantum key. Like a distributed database, but spread across time instead of space. The timeline manipulators couldn't erase it because they couldn't find all the pieces. We're not just carrying information, we are the information. The train car shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the windows, they could see other trains frozen in temporal stasis, their passengers unaware of the reality-bending events unfolding around them. The neural agent TX-88 had cleared from the air, but its effects lingered, keeping their temporal awareness heightened. Blake and his people, Karen said suddenly. They're not working for the timeline manipulators. They're working for us. Or they will be. That's why they planted the devices, not to hurt us, but to ensure we be here at the convergence point. Dr. Chen's temporal compass spun wildly before settling on a new reading. The temporal wake is expanding. Soon, even non-anchors will begin to notice the anomalies. We have to complete Operation Reset before the fabric of reality becomes too unstable. Michael moved to the center of the car, where the holographic display now showed a complex web of intersecting timelines. Roberts knew he couldn't stop them from changing the past, so he came up with a different solution. Instead of preventing their changes, he weaponized them. Margaret finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. Every change they made created new temporal anchors, new versions of us. The more they tried to stop us, the stronger our network became. The quantum key suddenly projected a new message, this one showing Roberts in a different setting, looking even older. If you're seeing this, then all the pieces are in place. The Prometheus Protocol isn't just a discovery, it's a choice. Humanity finds something in 2047 that gives us the power to reshape reality itself. The timeline manipulators believe they're protecting humanity by preventing this discovery. What they don't understand is that their very efforts to prevent it are what make it inevitable. Karen checked her own temporal readings on a device that had materialized from her memories of another timeline. The convergence is accelerating. Multiple versions of history are trying to occupy the same space-time coordinates. Through the windows, they could see it happening. Buildings from different eras overlapped, transparent and ghost-like. Cars from the 1950s drove through modern streets. Future architecture shimmered like mirages above current skylines. But why here? Michael wondered aloud. Why this train, this moment? Dr. Chen's expression was grim. Because this is where it all started. In the original timeline, this train accident finished everyone on board. The timeline manipulators went back and prevented it, thinking they were preserving key historical figures. But that change created the first temporal anchors, Margaret realized. The survivors of an accident that never happened, carrying memories of a future that never was. We're not just agents or operatives. We're temporal paradoxes given consciousness. The countdown suddenly accelerated dramatically, 5 hours 13 minutes and 42 seconds. They're making their final push, Karen announced, reading the temporal distortion patterns. They're trying to collapse all possible timelines into a single, safe reality. Michael looked at each member of his team, temporal anchors from different timelines, all brought together by Robert's impossible plan. They still don't understand. The Prometheus Protocol isn't something humanity discovers. It's something we become. The quantum key's light had become almost blindingly bright. Outside, the overlapping realities had created a kaleidoscope of possibility, a visual representation of all potential futures trying to exist simultaneously. Operation Reset, Margaret said softly, finally understanding. We're not trying to reset the timeline. We're trying to reset reality itself. To create a new framework that can contain all possibilities without collapsing. Dr. Chen's temporal compass suddenly stabilized, all its readings pointing to a single coordinate in space-time. The convergence point is reaching critical mass. When it peaks, everything changes, Michael finished. Or nothing does. Or both. The Prometheus Protocol isn't about choosing one timeline over another. It's about transcending the very concept of linear time. The countdown reached 1 minute, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Through the temporal distortions, they could see Blake and his team watching from another timeline, their earlier hostility replaced by grim determination. In another overlap, they saw Roberts, not as a recording, but as a temporal echo, nodding in approval. The moment of transformation was approaching, and with it, the true purpose of their mission would be revealed. Because Operation Reset wasn't just about saving the world. It was about giving humanity the choice that the timeline manipulators had tried so desperately to prevent, the choice to become something more than slaves to linear time. The final minute stretched like an eternity, each second pregnant with the weight of countless possible futures. The quantum key in Margaret's hands had become a miniature sun, its blue light now containing hints of colors that human eyes had never been meant to see. Through the overlapping realities visible outside the train windows, they could see versions of themselves from other timelines, some allies, some enemies, all essential parts of Robert's grand design. 30 seconds, Karen announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The neural agent TX-88 had done more than just awaken their temporal awareness. It had prepared their minds for what was coming. The temporal mesh network is fully synchronized. Dr. Chen's temporal compass had transformed, its simple needle replaced by a complex holographic display showing the convergence of all possible timelines. The timeline manipulators are making their final attempt, he reported, watching energy signatures pulse across dimensions. They're trying to force a temporal lockdown, a single, unchangeable timeline. Michael stood at the center of the train car, where the holographic displays had merged into a swirling vortex of information. He could see everything now, every version of himself, every choice made and unmade, every path taken and untaken. "They still don't understand," he said softly. "You can't force humanity to follow a single path. The very attempt creates new branches, new possibilities." Through one of the temporal overlaps, they saw Blake leading his team in another timeline, fighting against security forces trying to shut down Project Eclipse. In another, Roberts stood before a government committee, presenting evidence of the timeline manipulator's existence. In yet another, Dr. Chin worked in his laboratory, making the breakthrough that would lead to the first temporal anchor. 15 seconds, Karen called out. Margaret's fingers danced across the quantum key's surface, inputting the final sequence. "Roberts knew this would happen," she said, understanding flooding her features. "Not because he saw the future, but because he saw all futures. The Prometheus Protocol isn't just about transcending time, it's about embracing all possibilities simultaneously." The train car shuddered as reality itself began to buckle under the strain of temporal convergence. Outside, the overlapping timelines had created a prismatic effect, splitting the world into infinite variations of itself. Passengers in other cars remained frozen in temporal stasis, protected from the transformation by their very inability to perceive it. 10 seconds, Karen announced. Dr. Chen's eyes widened as his instruments registered a new phenomenon. The temporal wake, it's not just affecting space-time. It's affecting consciousness itself. The human mind is evolving to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. 5 seconds, Karen's voice had taken on an otherworldly quality, as if spoken by multiple versions of herself at once. Michael felt it beginning, the transformation that Roberts had prepared them for. His consciousness expanded, touching other versions of himself across countless timelines. He saw his life not as a single line but as an infinite web of possibilities, each choice creating new branches, new realities. 3. Margaret's quantum key pulsed in harmony with the temporal mesh network, connecting all temporal anchors across all timelines. Through these connections, Michael could feel humanity's collective consciousness awakening to its new potential. 2. The timeline manipulators made their final move, attempting to collapse all possibilities into their chosen, safe, timeline. But their very action created new branches, new anchors, new possibilities. Their effort to limit humanity had become the key to its transcendence. 1. Time stopped. Or perhaps it was better to say that time became irrelevant. The train car existed in all possible moments simultaneously, past, present, and future merged into a single, infinite now. Through the windows, they could see reality transforming, not into chaos, but into something more complex and beautiful than any single timeline could contain. The Prometheus Protocol activated, not as a weapon or a tool, but as a fundamental shift in human consciousness. Each person on Earth, in every timeline, became aware of their other selves, their other choices, their other possibilities. The timeline manipulator's greatest fear, humanity's inability to handle such awareness, proved unfounded. Instead of breaking under the weight of infinite possibility, the human mind adapted, evolved, transcended. Michael looked at his team, Margaret, Karen, Dr. Chin, and saw them not just as they were in this moment, but as they were across all moments. He saw Roberts too, not as a recording or a temporal echo, but as a constant presence across the mesh network of time, his plan unfolding exactly as it always had, always would, always was. The choice, Michael said, speaking to all versions of humanity across all timelines, was never about which future to choose. It was about choosing all futures, about accepting that every possibility is real, that every path is valid. The quantum key's light subsided, not because its power had diminished, but because its energy had become part of the new fabric of reality. The holographic displays winked out, unnecessary now that humans could perceive temporal information directly. The train car settled into its new state of being, existing simultaneously in every moment it had ever occupied or would occupy. Through the windows, they could see the city transforming, not into any single version of itself, but into a magnificent quantum metropolis that contained all versions. Buildings from different eras existed simultaneously, their architectures blending into impossible but beautiful forms. People walked the streets, each now aware of their infinite selves, each understanding their role in the vast tapestry of possibility.